Hello everyone, in today's video I'm going to be reviewing Back to the Future Part 2 from 1989. Back to the Future Part 2 was released on November 22nd, 1989. It grossed $336 million at the box office. It was well received and mixed reviews by some critics and audiences, but since then it's gained a cult following over the years. Fresh off the success of the first film, once again Robert Zemeckis directed the film. Michael J. Fox, Christopher Lloyd, Thomas F. Wilson, and Leah Thompson all reprised their roles from the first movie. The story to Back to the Future Part 2 goes, Doc Brown, Marty, and Jennifer go to the year 2015 to prevent his son from going to jail and destroying the McFly legacy. Old Biff goes back to 1955 and gives his younger self a sports almanac book that Marty originally bought to bet on winning sports teams to win money. He bets on the sports winning teams and becomes rich. The problem with this is, this causes an alternate 1985 where Biff is rich, corrupt, powerful, is married to Marty's mother, and he murdered George McFly. Marty and Doc have to go back to 1955 to get the sports almanac book so they can fix their reality in the proper timeline. Despite the mixed reaction this film gets, I think it's an okay film. I mean, it doesn't top the first film. To me, it's a very solid sequel that tries to at least do something different, but it kind of follows the same cliches and plot element as the first film, but just done a little differently. For example, when Marty's in the year 2015, when he fights Griff and his gang, it's basically rehashing the first film. The only difference is he's on a hoverboard instead of a skateboard. It doesn't capture the magic with the first film, but to me it's still an okay, decent, solid sequel. Some of my favorite scenes in the movie are, I like how we see the future of the McFly family, how we see that Marty is not a famous rock and roll musician because of an accident. Marty McFly's son, Marty Jr., is a loser, a wimp, and a smartass. Marty's daughter is just your basic, stereotype, everyday teenage girl. We also get the sense and feeling that Jennifer is not happy in her marriage and with her life because of Marty's accident. One other hint I also got in the film, even though it's not explained, I got this sense and feeling that when the Marty McFly family are all having dinner pizza together, Lorraine asks Marty, where's Jennifer? And he says, I'm not sure where Jennifer is, Mom. I have a hard time keeping track of her these days. That can mean she's either having an affair or she's just going out shopping like crazy, but even though it's not explained, I could be overanalyzing the bet. It's just a thought I've always thought about. Seeing Marty get fired in front of his family is embarrassing and humiliating. Boy, that sucks to get fired at your own home. I love it when Doc Brown explains the alternate timeline to Marty. When we see what Hill Valley looks like in the year 2015, how cars are flying, technology's gotten advanced. The tunnel scene when Marty's trying to get the almanac book from Biff is very intense. I love the cliffhanger ending setting up for the third movie. I love it when the current Marty goes to Doc Brown in 1955 and he goes, ah! And he goes, it can't be you. I sent you back to the future. And he tells him back from the future. And Doc Brown's response is, great Scott! And he faints. And then it just ends right there. I like the scenes when Biff meets his older self and not knowing that it's him, and when 1985 Doc Brown meets 1955 Doc Brown. It's kind of like how when if a younger or a future older self came to you in your current time, telling you, reminding you that this is your future. One of my favorite lines in the movie is when old Biff gives young Biff the sports almanac and he tells him, why don't you make like a tree and get out of here? And he slaps him in the back of the head and he goes, it's leave, idiot, you leave. It's like, why don't you make like a tree and leave? You sound like a damn fool when you say it. It's just funny how when he corrects himself. After the success of the first film, director Robert Zemeckis said that he had no intention or interest to make a sequel to Back to the Future because he thought that Back to the Future was just meant to be a standalone film and didn't need a sequel. But the studio was forcing him and pressuring him to make a sequel because fans and audiences wanted a sequel to see what happened to Marty and Jennifer and Doc Brown when they go to the future. Crispin Glover, who played George McFly from the first film, was set to reprise his role from the first film, but he had trouble with the studio because of contract and money problems. He was asking for more money. The studio would not give him the money that he wanted, so he ended up backing out of the project. And Robert Zemeckis used scenes from the first film. And Glover sued Robert Zemeckis in the studio for using his scenes from the first film without his permission. Kind of amazing me as a kid growing up how I never noticed something like this. Even back then, like before there was like internet, I never would have guessed something like this as a kid watching the film. I always assumed that was Crispin Glover, but I just never guessed that that was just really footage from the first film they were using. Kid watching this film, I never would have guessed that that was not him as old George McFly. I assumed that that was him, because it looks just like him, but that's the idea of that actor who played him. Jeffrey Wiseman replaced Crispin Glover as George McFly, and I tell you, very convincing, because it's hard to tell the difference. You assume that that was Crispin Glover, but it wasn't. Watching this film, I never noticed how Elizabeth Shue replaced Claudia Wells as Jennifer. I always just assumed that it was the same actress, but not knowing that it was like completely different. Because Claudia Wells turned down this film because her mother was sick and dying of cancer at the time. And they got Elizabeth Shue, fresh out the Karate Kid, replacing Claudia Wells as Jennifer. Okay, here's a little bit of an analysis and a comparison how Back to the Future's Part 2 2015 to the real 2015, about how that film predicted things that did come true and technology and gadgets that we do have today. Years ago, on October 26, 2015, everybody was celebrating that day because that was the day when Doc Brown and Marty McFly go to the year 2015 to save his son from going to jail. Came out, no one at the time was thinking about how 2015 would turn out to be. But now that we have lived through that year and that date, people have a perspective and a different point of view of how they see that day, especially now when they watch the movie. And they analyze what came true from that film to death. One thing I forgot to mention earlier about how when Robert Zemeckis was making this film, he didn't want this film like set in the future, and he also did not like the idea how he was like making up of what 2015 was going to be like, because he doesn't like sci-fi films that are not 100% accurate how the future was in that a certain year. One thing Robert Zemeckis forgot to realize, it's called the imagination, it's called pretending. Okay, here's my analysis. The first thing, right off the top of the bat to get out of the way, where the hell are the hoverboards in 2020? I mean, technically we do have hoverboards, but they're not really like what the movie was. It's more like you stand on it and it rolls around like a scooter instead of a handle. You're just scooting around with like no handle, hands-free. So technically we got them, but they're just not like the film is what we thought they would be. So what you see is what you get out of a hoverboard in 2020. What Robert Zemeckis said, he said that the hoverboards in the film are not like what you see in the film. It was all like fake and practical than really hovering. We don't have flying cars yet, but although Tesla, Ford, Mercedes-Benz, and Nissan, they've been working on making attempts of trying to create like the first flying car. I mean, they've been experimenting for years, like since like early 2000s, on trying to come up with one of the first flying cars, but this is probably going to take a long, long time until we have the first ever flying car. And the other thing too is if they do come out with flying cars, instead of a driver's license, you'll need a pilot's license. But once gave a good point on how, thank God we don't have flying cars like right now, because think about it. If we had flying cars, we'd have more accidents up in the air than we would down in the air, so maybe it's a good thing we don't have flying cars at all, but who knows. The clothing they wear in Hill Valley 2015, we do not dress up like that today. Although, granted, people do like to dress up occasionally on like Halloween parties or Comic-Cons, dressing up a certain character from a different era, or wearing a different style from a different era or a different decade. Skype and Zoom. Okay, this one is debatable because you can debate that Star Trek predicted this first, before this movie. Which is very true. The only difference is I feel like this movie was like almost accurate because this happened like at least like 20, 30 years later that we got Skype and Zoom where we can like video chat on our phones or Skype or Zoom on our computers. The only difference is in the movie, when they're Skyping and Zooming with somebody, it doesn't tell us our age, where we live, or our hobbies. We just Skype and Zoom with the person. That's it. Let me tell you another thing. The part where Marty gets fired, oh man, that's embarrassing and it sucks, especially how the comfort of your own home in front of your family, that is probably one of the worst ways to get fired from your job. Say that was predicting about how that instead of being fired at your job, nowadays people either get fired off the internet through email or Skype and Zoom, probably, depending on the situation. How his boss was monitoring his credit card, which that actually is very true these days, how everything is like all monitored. Like, for instance, this cell phone is wired by the government, or TVs, computers, everything is all like wired and tapped these days. One size that fits all, or anytime we get wet, our clothes don't dry automatically just like that. We have to wait for a few hours for our clothes to dry. And of course, there's no one size that fits all because everyone has different sizes, so I don't know if this will ever happen, if like they'll ever be like have t-shirts or pants where if it doesn't fit, it could just like literally fit the size automatically. Food and pizza. They supposedly have these, but I just don't know like where you can get these and like what brands they have on the market for these. But from what I've heard, they're not really exactly what they claim they are, and they don't taste that good. They're not as healthy for you as they sound. Either make your own pizza or get real pizza at a pizzeria. Don't rehydrate your food and pizza. His family room, he has a big screen television. Now this actually came true because we have big screen TVs today. The difference is depending on like what kind of TV brand or where you buy your TV, you could either buy like 70, 80, or now they do have a 100-inch, but I think the 100-inch is a lot expensive than like a 70 or 80-inch television. Junior comes home, he's watching television, he's got 6 different channels on, and believe it or not, this actually was a thing, but it didn't really last that long. They discontinued this like over 20 years ago. But believe it or not, it really was a thing where you could actually watch multiple channels, but I'm glad they kind of stopped that because I myself, for one, could not watch 6 or different channels because I don't have that kind of like retention span, but then again, none of us do. It's just better if we watch one channel at a time than 6 channels. Phones have been discontinued since the late 2000s, even though we don't have payphones anymore, but I do know that some other countries do still have payphones. Like, for example, I know that in Europe, they still have payphones. And despite how, like, payphones have been discontinued for, like, over 15 to 20 years almost, I do know that people have said that they found payphones, like, here and there. Tying your shoes, the sad part is we still tie our own shoes. We don't have shoes that automatically tie for ourselves. Sorry. But although I know that they did try to like come up with an attempt to make shoes that tie themselves, but they're still also working on that, just like the same as flying cars. But honestly, I'm used to tying my shoes at this point in my life. I don't care. I wouldn't be bothered if they didn't come out with shoes that tie for you. It is what it is. I'm used to it. I'd rather tie my own shoes. Shoes is not overrated, James Earl Jones. Pun intended. Reality and caller ID. This film predicted it very well, especially like nowadays how we have like goggles, sunglasses, where people like do like have like their own like virtual reality. I mean, I know what they are, but I just don't know like what the point is or like why it's so like big and popular. How when people like put on these goggles, they like create their own reality, if I'm not mistaken. I'll be honest, this is something I really don't know much about, even though I know what it is, but I have like not much knowledge on it, so feel free to leave me a comment, explain the whole point, like why people like have these like goggles of virtual reality. I did my best on that one, so yeah, moving on. Also how like we have caller ID these days, because in the movie when McFly gets a phone call from Needles, the daughter looks at the goggles and she says, "Dad, it's for you. It's Needles." Because nowadays, when people call, they have caller ID of knowing who's calling. It also lets you know it's scam you. That way, you know it's a fake number. And voice activations, because when Marty comes home from work, the house voice activate says, "Welcome home, Marty." Because nowadays we have like, things like that tell us to automatically do things like, Alexa, wash my dishes. Alexa, open the refrigerator. Or Alexa, tell me how to make a recipe. As is for fruit, the plants come down, you get some grapes, because now it's like, Alexa, can I please have some food or whatever? Technology is getting like so advanced that people rely on them so much rather than like doing things the old-fashioned way. Cafes dedicated to a certain decade, like the 50s, the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Like me, for instance, I have a huge fascination with the 80s for someone who was not born in the 80s, because I grew up watching 80s films, and this was one of them. There's a lot of people out there today, in this modern day, who are obsessed with the past and just cannot accept living in their own reality. Times. Or listen to a song from a different decade, or read a book from a different time period, and just like escape themselves and lose themselves, imagine themselves living in that time period. Finally won a World Series after like a 108-year drought, going back from 1946 when they lost the World Series to the Detroit Tigers because of Billy the Goat. Finally won a World Series in 2016. They didn't win in 2015, but they were close by 1 year at least. And plus, they deserved to win after a 108-year drought. On October 26, 2015, they won 1 year later on November 2nd, 2016. Very close by 1 year, but no cigar for the writer of this movie. Team as the Miami Gators, but there is the Miami Marlins, originally known as the Florida Marlins. And there was a Cubs and Florida series. The only difference is it was not in the World Series. It was in the 2003 National League Championship Series. We all know that story. The Chicago Cubs were 5 outs away from going to the World Series until Moises Alou and Steve Bartman, and the rest is history after that. The Marlins scored 8 runs that inning. That ruined the Cubs' chances of going to the World Series in that game. Team, the curse was finally broken and they won the World Series. So now the Cub fans can finally forgive Steve Bartman. A Yankee fan, I'm glad the Cubs finally won a World Series. Just glad I didn't beat my Yankees. On Back to the Future Part 2 and my analysis. Hope you enjoyed it. Please hit the like button and subscribe and hit the notification button to get new content and updates on my channel.